the plan today is to mark out the position of the Scottish Government Army, the front line, particularly Mackay's regiment and Leven's regiment. And what we're showing with this first post is where the government line stood according to Transport Scotland. And the purpose of this is to simply focus on the feasibility of this position from the perspective of the terrain and of the capability of the muskets, to see if we can show how the musket balls that were found by the archaeologists, from where they could have been fired. What are the possible options?
Musket.
Be slightly lower than that.
Yeah, 1.4 meters. He probably had bracing himself.
Yep.
And
Like
he's
this?
firing like that.
So from slightly lower than the height of this.
Yeah.
We're also going to go up the slope now and mark the positions of where the archaeologists found the biggest fall of musket balls. So we've got a long pole. We'll bang that in in the centre part of where the musket balls were, and then I think we could come back here and see what we can see.
Yeah, I think the other thing you've got to look at the geometry, because where the musket balls are falling is not where the guy with the musket was aiming at.
Yeah.
You've got to think that he's aiming at someone who's advancing on him. He's missed, and the musket ball's gone on to strike the ground behind him.
Yeah.
So they would have been much closer to the person firing than.
So there may have been an element of panic there, of firing, and some of those balls may have ended up in the ground as the men were so close.
Well, that's right, and we can see that because when we look at the section that we take through the site, we can see that there is a stepped ground up above.
Beyond it.
And anywhere up until 200, 300 metres beyond that, they would hardly have seen the Jacobites coming down the hill.
Yeah.
So the first inkling they got of seeing the Jacobites would be within 80 metres from them. The other thing you also have to look at is, we can see on the left-hand side here that there are a lot of musket balls going up the hill.
Yep.
And on the right-hand side, nothing.
Okay.
Virtually nothing found up further up the hill, and I think that can be explained by the difference in terrain, which were in front of Leven's troops and what was in front of Mackay's troops, because we have this step in front of Mackay, and because of that, the musket balls are essentially all being compressed into this
small area.
A small area, because it goes up.
Yep.
And all the musket balls are passing in front of the Jacobites and hitting this step and not travelling further up the slope. Whereas for Leven, if we show, and we can show that he was actually positioned further up the slope, he would have been firing parallel with the slope. So all his musket balls would be tending to travel further up the slope, and that's why you get that long distribution of musket balls on the left-hand side.
So the really interesting thing for me then is the Highlanders. There was no clan regiment assigned to attack Leven's regiment, and the Highlanders were very expert in terrain, and they may have decided not to assign anyone to Leven's regiment because of the exposure. Yep. They knew whatever regiment would have been exposed to several volleys, whereas people attacking Mackay's regiment slightly to the right would have been protected by the steppe ground. Yep. So it may well have affected the Highlanders' tactics on the day. So that's really interesting. Musket balls over there somewhere, I think.
Yeah, well, if I plotted it, they would have been within about 4 metres of the last volley would have been, the front line would have been within 4 metres.
Right.
Wow. I think that ties in with what Lakil says.
Yeah. No.
And then a line of the cross. There's a collection of musket balls here.
Yeah.
So this is more or less the furthest one down the slope. There's a large collection.
So we put a pole here.
One pole here, and we could put another pole
over there.
Yeah.
This staff that we're going to put up now is 4 meters 15. So actually slightly longer than I thought. Hopefully.
So David, this marker is what?
This is one of, there's a collection of musket balls on this slope, and this is the first of the musket balls, or the start of that collection, looking from upslope.
So we're going to put one here, and then we're going
to put another one at the other end of the collection.
Okay, actually one there. Yeah. When you did your sections, you said you looked at the lidar and you looked at it or you cut out the A9.
I did, yes.
What does that mean? Is that based on a pre-A9 levels, or is that estimating where the A9 was?
I have simply cut out the A9, so it's a conservative. So,
Okay.
so what you can see is further along the slope here, there was a bank,
Okay.
and when the A9, the present A9 was built, they cut that bank out. So
Okay.
all I've done is take a straight line from the top of that bank
Across.
across. So
Okay.
it's a conservative one. So it'll make the picture a conservative in terms of deciding on where the banks were further off the slope.
Yeah.
So what we don't want is, because in the lidar data it's such a high resolution, you're picking up trees,
Yep.
bushes.
Okay.
This wall here was
So you've
visible.
taken out some of the noise.
I've taken all of that out, so
Yeah.
we're back down to bare earth.
Okay. Perfect. If you look back up here, you can definitely see.
The start of another.
You can see the bund where
Yeah.
just this side of the A9, but below this, from the fence post down to us, you can see the start of another step.
Yes.
And it would be therefore completely logical for this. This marks basically the government troops as they came down towards the government line, which we're going to try and fix in a minute. They would have been charging across this piece of ground, and they would have emerged roughly where those trees are.
Somewhere
maybe
about
a
80
little bit.
meters. About 80 meters I calculated.
80 metres from the government line,
From
where
the
you
government-
think the government
where
line
I think the government line was. They would
Okay.
have come over the top and then they would have descended down the slope
Okay.
until they came to a fairly flat bit like we see here on the ground here.
The Highlanders now would be in their last stage of their charge. They would have been full run at this point, obviously to minimise their exposure to the musket fire. So it's quite easy to see them having covered 40 metres really quickly,
Yeah.
30 metres. So this musket, so it's quite, what I think would be worth doing again, once we've cut this line, is to stand at the position where we think the government line was. We could get a height as to what an average soldier, where they would have stood.
1.4 meters
Yeah.
is what I've used. So.
And then we could actually see where
Where
they would
it
have fired,
intersects.
and where it intersects.
Yeah, so if you take that down the slope, you know where the troops are standing.
With the terrain, that's absolutely certain. They couldn't have been further
No,
away.
no.
Yeah, perfect. Great.
So this disc is representing where the musket ball fell. So when we walk up, this is what we should be looking at, and a bit lower for the musket fired from a man's shoulder. So here we are. So I've taken a section here, and this is where the Transport Scotland have plotted
Yeah.
where the government troops were.
Yeah.
And this is looking up the slope to where Lochiel was spotted as standing.
Yeah.
And in this dark area here is this is all the shadowed area where, if they'd been standing where Transport Scotland says, they wouldn't have seen the Jacobites at any point in this area because of the dip.
Yeah.
And this is illustrating with the Transport Scotland positions how they see it as they look up the slope to where the musket balls are which we're plotting now.
Yeah.
So we can see that they simply doesn't intersect. There's no intersection that would allow the musket balls to be in this position, having been fired here down the slope. This is what Transport Scotland have presented. They're obviously taking the government troop lines that they're shown, and they have simply gone with a flat earth. So these lines are representing, they're assuming that there is no bank here, and this is the firing positions or the firing distances as marked by Transport Scotland. So they've essentially totally ignored the terrain, and this is what they're presenting as their analysis of the battlefield.
Is that their actual document?
That is from Transport Scotland's GIS package online. So they haven't considered the terrain at all.
How can that be?
I don't know. I don't know why they haven't done it, frankly. They do use a GIS package, and I know the package they use does visibility analysis. So why they haven't done it, I really don't understand. What they're saying is that these are different.
See, there's a Jacobite.
This is what they call it, point blank range. I think what they're saying here is this is where the musket ball would have fired if from the government troop line they were firing parallel with the slope.
Okay.
And this takes into account the drop.
Okay.
So on a flat Earth,
This is
if they were firing parallel to flat Earth, this is where the musket balls would have landed naturally because of the air resistance and gravity.
but there's no account taken here of the steppe ground.
No account. This is just flat.
Yeah.
And then the light blue, I believe, is the maximum range at which they would start to fire, the maximum effective range, and then the dark blue is the optimal range at which they would start to fire. We know Mackay is aware of the terrain because he talked about Balfour on the extreme left wing having a very good field of fire. So
second left.
Yeah, second left. So he knows about that. So what I've done here actually, this is a visibility analysis on top of where Transport Scotland have their government lines. So we can see I've turned this around basically, and I'm now looking to see what the troop on the front line would see with where Transport Scotland are saying. So the pink areas is the areas they could have seen and fired to. So this is what Transport Scotland should have done when they were doing their analysis. And if they'd looked at this, they would have said, well, most of these troops would be totally ineffective in terms of firing. It's not possible for them to be in this position. A musket has fired up the hill and it struck the base of that flag. Yeah. And that's not happening. Yeah, no.
It's impossible, isn't it?
It's impossible.
It's in the shadow.
It's in the shadow.
That's the key point we must make. Yeah.
The mark where we can see visually intersecting with that pole.
Yep.
So when we get to the top, we'll see what the difference is between our line of sight and
The musket balls.
and the musket balls.
Yeah, that'd be very good. What we're looking at here is the position of the government line, the government regiments, as shown by Transport Scotland. So we are facing towards Mackay's regiment, and the two soldiers we've got here are the front line of Mackay's regiment as they stood on the day according to Transport Scotland. So a straight line right across from them right through to Urad House would be the line, again I would emphasise, as shown by Transport Scotland. They're aiming up the hill, right? So yes, they could have been, the Highlanders could have come over this step.
Yeah.
The only problem is there's no musket balls found in this step.
Right.
So where the musket balls are found are on those left flag lines.
So if they were here, and the Highlanders came there and they were shot at when they came over this hill, you would expect to find some musket balls in this field up here.
You'd expect to find the musket balls in this step ground here.
Yeah.
Instead of which, the only musket ball found are where the flag shows. And particularly important, of those musket balls found there, some were impacted, but the rest obviously were in the ground. The left-hand flag, that left-hand one, is where the biggest intensity or grouping of musket balls is found. But they're all on the same line.
What do you mean by impacted?
Impacted, all we mean is that they'd hit something hard enough to flatten the ball. That might have been a piece of equipment, a targe, a sword or something. And obviously at that point they would probably have dropped straight into the ground. The other ones we can only assume were fired into the ground. And what we're going to show in a minute is where we stand, when we establish, we can establish by section exactly where the Scottish government line could have stood in order to be able to fire those shots and hit into the ground. So I think the important thing is, as Pollard and Oliver said, the musket balls that they found here really represent the final volley of the government line of Mackay's regiment before they were impacted by the Highland charge. If you stand here and you look towards the post, you can just see a shiny object on the post. So we have marked on that on the flagpole we've marked the line of sight from a soldier standing here firing, and we're assuming a straight fired musket ball just skimming the top of the ridge there where it would have intersected with the flagpole. And you can just, if you look carefully, you can see the shiny mark of the disc. And that Lachlan was telling us was at his neck height, and he's 6'2". So it's
So how tall are you, Lachlan?
About 6'1".
6'1". Sorry, exaggerating.
So it's at your neck height?
Yeah.
Okay, so it wasn't even a body shot.
As if we were marching up the hill, you can very clearly see the CD, and a government soldier even firing from here would still not be able, his musket ball would still not impact on the ground where the musket balls were found. Let's just think about this. When you were doing the sections, you stripped away the topography, taking an average position for the A9, so a reasonably good estimate of what the ground looked like before the A9 was developed. Is that right? Just talk us through that.
Yeah, so what I've used is something they call lidar, which is a laser scanning technique, and it gives you very high resolution, very accurate information. But the bad thing about it, if you can say it's a bad thing, is it picks up everything. So it picks up the trees, it picks up the wall that's over there, and we don't want that in the analysis that we do. So we want to take it back to bare earth. So there are techniques for stripping away the surface information and just giving bare earth level. The other thing we have is the existing A9, so we have to cut out the A9 from the data set that we have. So I cut out around the side of the A9 and then just did a straight interpolation from the top slope downwards. And then we do something called a visibility analysis, which sounds really high-tech and complicated and something that no one's ever seen. But if you've ever been looking to decide what mobile operator you want to use, and they give you they say what is our coverage in an area, you might have gone to a web page and put in your position and seen whether it's O2 or EE. That's a visibility analysis when you see that plot on the web. So what they're doing there is they're looking at where the transmission mast is, and they're using the terrain to work out how far a transmission from that mobile transmission mast and where it'll reach within the terrain. So this is technology that people are using already. I'm doing that with musket balls, and what I did is I set a 0 level for here and a 1.4 meter for the guy who's firing. So we're doing a visibility analysis from this point out towards where the musket would have been fired.
Okay, so just two things we can sort of say now. You just remind us where we've tied the disc to the flagpole, that was the intersection standing where Transport Scotland said the government line was. With a musket ball fired in this direction, it will intersect where the flagpole is on that disc, roughly.
Yeah.
So we can measure the height of that, and then what we're going to do now is we're going to measure back from where the musket ball was found in the ground to where we think the government line was.
So Lachlan, you're going to be the advancing Jacobite. Right?
Yep.
You two, we want you to be where we're going to work out. So we're going to now do a visual. We're going to walk down the hill until we can just, you see the tape at the bottom, until that starts to disappear.
Right.
And that will be where the troops, the government troops are standing.
Not much further than this.
Yeah. Okay, come forward, Lachlan. Now, you've got to imagine you're holding a musket. So you're standing here, and you're aiming at the middle of his body.
Come on, Ben.
And when his middle of his body is intersecting with the top of the tape, that's when you would have fired, because you're not going to be firing at his feet. Keep coming.
Keep coming. So he's now screaming. He's about 2 yards in front of you. This is your last chance to save yourself.
That's when you would have fired.
That's when you would have fired. So Cameron of Lochiel, his regiment decimated Mackay's regiment. After the rout, they came back and inspected their work, and the Highlanders said they were really shocked at what they had done. Most of them had not fought in a big battle before, and they said that the government troops lay where they'd been lined up. So they were cut to pieces here, right where you're standing. They lay in their lines. That's what Cameron of Lochiel said. They lay here almost exactly in the lines that they'd stood. You can imagine, if you just imagine what you've just visualized here, where you were firing, the Highlander would have been 4 or 5 yards in front of you. You were equipped with a musket. On your belt would have been a plug bayonet. You fired that musket, then you had to put your musket on the ground and you had to take your plug bayonet and put it in the front, and then you had to get it up again. What are your chances of doing that? Well, the guy's got 4 yards to come with his sword. None. So I think the interesting thing is some historians have since started to question this idea of whether the plug bayonet caused the problem. But I think if we reenact it here, the final volley was fired when the Highlanders were 4 or 5 yards in front of the government line. There was no time to put the plug bayonet in. And the interesting thing for me is General Hugh Mackay subsequently invented the ring bayonet. So he actually was the first person or has been attributed as the first person to invent the bayonet that goes on the side.
So the commander who was here
the
saw
commander
the
was here.
consequences and then designed the ring bayonet, which would allow them to fire and have the bayonet on the gun.
Yeah. So it's actually quite chilling. If you imagine yourself as a government soldier, it's pretty awful. Bard and Oliver, who did the Two Men in the Trench, they actually talk about this step ground being critical to the battle. So from here, we've got a flattish piece of ground. Where the line of trees is there is the end of another step. So if you go beyond from what David was saying earlier, when you go back to ground level and you look beyond that, there's another step. So the Highlanders would have appeared about 80 paces from here. So what we've described, Mackay talked about them firing in platoons. So we could visualize the clumps, the groups of a platoon firing at 80 paces, then the next one, then the next one. The final volleys were being fired by one of the platoons, but by that time the Highlanders were within 10 yards, like we've just seen. And remember what we've shown is that the final musket ball that landed at the foot of that staff would have been fired at a Highlander, assuming the person was trying to fire at the main part of their body, missed, or it went through them and landed on the ground there. That was 5-6 yards from where you were standing. We've moved back from where the musket ball was found in the ground, and we have sighted the line where we think Mackay's regiment would have stood. This is the ground marked by this post. Mackay's regiment would have been standing here. They would have been looking up the hill towards the advancing Highlanders, who'd come down over a step piece of ground, had emerged about 80 paces in front of us, advancing very aggressively, screaming the Highland war scream, in tightly bunched groups of men. If we think of a soldier here firing and aiming here at the Highlanders, we imagine a platoon standing here, and we assume logically aiming for their body. So where David is standing now, if I was aiming at his body and I miss, my musket ball might end up at the foot of that flagpole. So that's quite chilling in a way. They were 5 yards, what is that? 4 or 5 yards in front of the Mackay's regiment. We know that Cameron of Lochiel said after this point none of his soldiers were killed.
Are you going to put another post where
the Jacobites would have been when the last volley was fired?
Yeah.
There's no other post.
Is there no post there?
Not here.
What we're marking here is if Mackay's line stood marked by this post, and we imagine him aiming, a soldier standing here in the platoon, aiming at an advanced Highlander, aiming for his middle of his body. If they missed, you can just see the top of the tape from here. So a straight fired musket ball would have intersected the ground where that tape is. It is quite interesting that it's 4 or 5 yards between the last volley fired at the Highlanders and the government line.
The visibility analysis. This is where the government troops are shown by Transport Scotland, and as we've already discussed, it's no way that they could have been in that position and the musket ball arrive at the top. So here are where we have the musket balls, which are indicated by the flag behind, and the pink area is where we've done a visibility analysis, and we've used the lidar data, which we have then taken back to bare earth, and we've performed this visibility analysis from the musket ball location. So all the areas in pink indicate where in the terrain someone at 1.4 meters in height would be able to see the musket ball, and it clearly shows that none of the marked government positions would have been able to fire that musket ball, as Transport Scotland indicates.
And I think the other interesting thing just to mention is where you see these squares marked out here, that's marked out by the archaeologists, so we can see they did a detailed metal detector survey over these squares. And interestingly for me, they find the intense groups of musket balls here, but nothing on the slope below. There's virtually nothing found down there.
That's right. And just to indicate perhaps what you might have expected here, if you look on up here, this is another section where the archaeologists have been up behind the A9, and this is where Lieven's troops were, and you can see that there are musket balls all the way up the slope, so indicating that they were firing at Jacobites in this area. So, and what we don't see any of that in here, as if Lieven had been firing on this slope, but also tellingly we don't find them in the area behind either. So that what indicates to us is that all these musket balls, this is where they dropped off the second slope, and all the musket balls are impacted in this area behind and up that slope where the A9 is now. So a lot of those musket balls have disappeared because they've put the A9 in.
Yeah, and you said earlier that even standing here there is a shadow. So if we could have been able to walk the ground before the A9 was there, part of the reason we don't find any musket balls there is because that's also in shadow.
That's right. So there's a bank here. So the line finding here, there's no way because of the terrain, musket balls wouldn't have carried on beyond and up the slope.
So just to rehearse where we are, this line here is where Mackay's regiment was. Further over towards our red house and those trees is where another regiment, Lieven's regiment, stood. And we know from Cameron of Lochiel's account that none of the Highland regiments had been targeted to attack Lieven's regiment. From Hugh Mackay's account, we know that Lieven's regiment did a court to conversion. When they realised there were no Highlanders advancing to attack them, they swung round to support Mackay's regiment by swinging their left wing, wheeling and swinging their left wing uphill, and they then fired into the right-hand side of the Cameron regiment as they advanced over this ground we're standing on now.
So if any of these balls were coming from Lieven's regiment, then Lieven must also, where we've marked up the front line as being, then Lieven's regiment must at least have been in that position as well.
Yeah. And again, just to emphasise, this is the grouping of musket balls that Pollard and Oliver say was the final volley fired by the Scottish Government line.
We're standing here. We're standing here.
Yep.
These two flags are marking these musket positions, and Lieven's troops, as we think it should have been, they would have been in this area here. So, as I understand it, I don't understand the battle so much, but I understand that the cavalry came down from the Jacobite position here to attack, and they came down this slope. And what we find, and behind here, which you can't quite see, but there are a lot of musket balls found all the way up this hill. And what this very, very clearly shows that the only place they could have been fired from on the government side would have been from Lieven's troops here. So all these musket balls were from Lieven's troops, probably firing at the cavalry were coming down to attack Mackay.
And the reason why it could only been from Lieven's is what?
This is the visibility analysis. So I've taken one of the musket ball locations. I've done a visibility analysis again at 0 height and a man firing from 1.4 meters. And this shows
where
this is where the musket balls could have been fired.
If they'd been fired from anywhere else, they would have missed the ground.
They would have gone over, or they would have hit the ground before they got to this location. So it's impossible. This is the only point they could have been fired from on the government side. Yeah. So they were fired by Lieven.
What I find fascinating is we know the ground is substantially unaltered. So we're standing on exactly the spot where Hugh Mackay's regiment stood. So all of this visibility analysis is very difficult to dispute because it's just taking the facts and conjecturing, but basically asking the question, where is the possibility of the musket balls? Where could they have possibly come from? And they can only have come within the visibility, the area that's visible. General Hugh Mackay, in his own account, stresses how important he felt it was that his whole line maintained a straight line. He also tells about how he rode up and down the front of the line. So we can imagine General Hugh Mackay would have ridden right in front of us here. And we know that as he rode down here, he talked about the Highlanders firing at him, and he could hear the popping of their muskets as they fired at him. And some people fell, some people were hit in the regiments. They were aiming at him, but they missed and hit some of his soldiers. The important thing, I think, is that from this position here, this analysis, given Hugh Mackay said he kept his whole army in a straight line, we know where the government line stood. On this line, straight from the memorial cairn in front of Urad House all the way to the Gurneg, and basically right on the A9, within 80 metres of the A9. You need to remember the two armies faced each other for nearly 2 hours, and there was quite a lot of activity during that period. One of the interesting bits of activity was the Jacobites sent snipers down, advanced close towards the government lines. David, can you just talk us through what you...
So we know quite well where the sniper position was because of the two men in the trench. So they actually identified it. They went up there. They found some musket shots, planted musket shots.
In a wall, I think they found a buckle and there's various things they found, and they, in their view, they were quite confident that that was the position.
So we plotted up that position. This is where we're standing, is just about here. These red lines are where Transport Scotland say the government troops were. So we've done another visibility analysis here, and obviously we're looking for a sniper standing in the house that was here. So this is at 1.4 meters, the sniper's height, looking down towards where the government troops were, and I'd assume 1.4 meters for the government troops. So assuming they're not just going to fire it ahead. So this is the green areas show the areas that would have been visible, and we can see virtually all of Mackay's troops were completely hidden.
By Transport Scotland's Mackay.
These are Transport Scotland Mackay positions, and we can see that the sniper would not have been able to see them to fire at them. Mm-hmm. But if we take the positions that we have plotted up now, they would have been in this green area here. So within
Very
the sniper's
visible. Yeah, within range and visibility.
Within range and visibility, yes.
Yeah.
Why the snipers have come down the hill.
Yeah.
So Lockheed up here, they would have known they couldn't have fired at these positions and hoped to hit them. That's why they had to come down the hill to within range.
Yep, very good. We're standing right on the pivotal part of the battle. This is where the pivotal part of the battle took place. Cameron's men came down here. We know they suffered over 120 casualties. Half the Cameron regiment were killed right in front of us here. We know that the Mackay's regiment was completely decimated, and that turned the battle. In this area between where we're standing and the A9 is where all the fighting took place. This is where all the dead bodies were lined up, extending right across to the Gurneg on the government right flank. And we have to ask the question, why would we want to build a new road right over this ground where so many people fought and died on that day in 1689, particularly when there is an alternative available.